Out of all of the numbered entries in Shin Megami Tensei, 4 has amongst the most numerous and most unique design contributions to the series. This was the first game where Kaneko-sensei had stepped down as demon and character designer, and while Doi-sensei had taken over as character designer, the new demon designs contributed to this game were done by guest artists who relied on submitting drafts for feedback to try and get across key themes in the designs, in much the same way that Kaneko-sensei's best designs do. In fact, many of these guest artists were fans of Kaneko-sensei, which was their motivation to contribute to the project in the first place. The combination of designs from different artists with different styles and priorities gives the demons of SMT5 a stronger sense of diversity than every other game in the series, in my opinion. But unfortunately, none of these designs, to my knowledge, have since made a returning appearance outside of For Apocalypse, where Doi redrew the images in order to give a more consistent sense to the recruitable demons, losing said diversity as a consequence, in my opinion. That's a shame because while 4 may be lacking in the powerful atmosphere that made previous games so immersive, these artists being given the opportunity to give their own interpretations to mythologies and historical persons, both in contributing to new designs and revamping classic ones, results in some of the absolute best designs in the franchise's 30-year history. Now, that doesn't mean that every design is great, and much like Yidun in 5, there are a few like Centaur whose design is strong, but unfitting for the demon it's been assigned to, and would work much better if given to another equestrian demon yet to appear. Without further ado, here are my top 6 best demon designs that I would like to see return in Persona 6. A recurring theme with the guest artists hired for this project was their work on tokusatsu, and the artist responsible for Kogasaburo, one Tomotsu Shinohara-sensei, specifically had experience on the monolithic Super Sentai series, which might go a ways in explaining why this design is somewhat similar to Ryo from Juken Sentai Geki Ranger, the basis for Power Rangers Jungle Fury. Kogasaburo is my personal favorite demon design that took influence from tokusatsu in part because of how this design manages to combine the tokusatsu elements with fantastical ones that would have been difficult in live action. Most notably, the severed arms that turn into snakes at the top, a detail that has its origins in the legend that says Kogasaburo was turned into a snake after escaping the underworld, and which is also present in Kogasaburo's chest, looking like a snake as well. These details are what elevate this design above fellow National Defense Divinity designed by Shinohara-sensei, Tenkai, who similarly feels tokusatsu inspired, but without the flair that the fantastical details give to Kogasaburo, and the similar presence that Shinohara-sensei gave to the Minotaur. Speaking of which, this one is probably the most obvious demon design to appear on this list, as it's a fan favorite, immediately impactful, and is also the most iconic boss in the game. Much like Matator, the Minotaur is a skill check that ensures that the player understands the mechanics of how the press-turn combat system works, as well as buffs, debuffs, and ironically however, the Minotaur also exposes the issues of the combat, namely how unbalanced smirking can be, and the issues of chance that can arise by not controlling which partner helps in battle. However, what makes me love the Minotaur just that little bit more was how useful he was as a party member come Tokyo. I managed to fuse a Minotaur with the skill Resist Ice, which actually saved me from a game over while I was grinding, and every other party member had been knocked out by a Wendigo. The Minotaur managed to clutch the fight and I survived without losing my progress, which remains a massive point in the Minotaur's favor, as I continue to have a strong affinity towards this demon whenever I replay SMT4. A lot of people have underestimated just how good physical skills are in SMT4, and this is because of how the press turn system naturally rewards a diverse range of magic in the party. but given how few enemies also resist physical, and it generally does more damage, a strong physical tank, especially with buffs and debuffs, should never be underestimated and can be especially useful if you are low on SP in my experience. And Minotaur was my favorite to fill that niche precisely because of this episode. That all said, I actually want this design to be used in a very specific way. The Minotaur has had a multitude of designs over the years, and what I would do if I were in charge is use one of those for Minotaur while using this design for Asterius. Asterius, for those unaware, is a separate demon in canon, but in mythology is actually the Minotaur's name, and who was available as a gaudier palette swap of Minotaur as a DLC demon. This color scheme is just a lot better, and would be a good one to use on Asterius specifically, since, discounting being a unique persona in Persona 4 Arena, he's only been shown with this gaudier design in the series to date. Speaking of Asterius, there is a recurring theme of the palette swap DLC demons being worse versions of their counterparts, with one exception. Asmodeus has a very impactful design through the striking blood red and various little details that make it immediately eye-catching. While Asterius was a gaudier minotaur, Aishma preserves most of what I liked about Asmodeus' design. While white and red naturally invoke very different emotions, I can still see the white version working because it makes the armor feel like it's made of bones. Hence why I'm kind of combining these two for this section. My only issue with the palette swap is a very minor nitpick, and that's that the scant rings of white on Asmodeus weren't made red with the palette swap, which would have made for a better use of color in my opinion. I just really like the combination of red accents on white, which I feel would have really worked here because it could have symbolically represented blood on the bone white armor. That one nitpick aside, this is one of my favorite interpretations of a demonic knight or king in any media. It's very detailed and has various easy to miss snippets of lore in its design, which I always appreciate in 2D art specifically. And while some can argue that this is a very basic depiction of a demon, that's not a bad thing. A lot of the best demon designs from Kaneko-sensei get across a specific idea in only 2D artwork, and a basic design at their core like Angel, Terminator, Matador to name a few. And I would consider this version of Asmodeus/Aishma to be in the same general camp, just with a greater emphasis on the detailed, elaborate armor. Unlike every demon before it on this list, Michizane is not a mandatory boss, but an optional one who can only be fought and thus fused after the fact if the player sides with Walter during the Law-Chaos split as a part of a boss rush of National Defense divinities under the control of Tayama. This means that it is possible to do a playthrough without ever encountering and thus being unable to fuse Michizane by siding with Jonathan instead. Contrary to what you might think, that's not specifically a criticism. Japanese historic persons tend to be chaos aligned, and I actually think that it's a clever callback to restrict some demons based off of the franchise's historic tendencies to the respective law and chaos roots. Neutrality is another matter since some of the demons restricted are pretty questionable. Masakado is the only exception, not only for narrative reasons but also, again, as a callback to SMT1. Much like fellow National Defense divinities Kogasaburo, Tenkai, and Yasuo Magatsuhi, this is a memorable design accurate to mythology and with various little details that I appreciate the more that I look into the history and legend of Sugawara no Michizane, even if its bias towards being the cause of disasters overshadows that this is also a Shinto god of learning and historic scholar. Both Michizane and Asmodeus are such good designs that it's hard to fathom that they both came from the same artist who gave us Voldemort Lucifer, But yes, the late Yasuhiro Nirasawa sensei not only contributed two of the best designs for this game, but also one of the most reviled in the franchise's history, as well as Centaur, who I touched upon in the intro. Yoshihiro Nishimura sensei is a legendary J-horror director and practical effects artist. Matter of fact, the staff at Atlus were fans of his work, which is why they, quote, begged him to contribute the designs for the game. He didn't design many for this game, only designing 3 in total, and out of them, the only one who was so much as a contender was Yasuo Magatsuhi, with the other 2, Omorikane and Pluto, being good but not great in my opinion. Nishimura sensei's works were actually sculptures that he submitted and were then turned into 2D sprites by in-house staff, which explains why these designs specifically lacked the same recognizable style between them that the other artists brought to their contributions. Horror was specifically something that SMT5 struggled with aesthetically, despite Doi wanting to invoke that aesthetic with Manan Gal, and fought for her inclusion into the game. The reason why this design failed in that regard is because of how sexualized her design and animations were, coming across as comedic and hitting like a joke over actually being frightening. By contrast, Nishimura sensei purposely went with a design that aesthetically would both be funny in its absurdity, but still terrifying, and so this decaying, rotting head of a giant came to be. The staff seemed somewhat committed to carrying on this portrayal by giving Yasuo Magatsuhi the Pokemon-esque quirk of saying its name in-game, as well as the use of general drunkenness to disorient the protagonist at one point in time. Much like some of the more absurd yokai of Japanese legends, the absurdity adds to horror by defying reason and logic, as if this were a comedy while playing itself entirely straight to feel like it's straight out of the Lovecraft mythos. And given that it managed that with a 2D sprite, just imagine the nightmares that our second National Defense divinity will invoke with a 3D model in a hypothetical Persona 6. And now, before we get to our number 1 slot, let's go over some honorable mentions. Astaroth. While undeniably a great design, this version of Astaroth feels like it works better in 2D than 3D due to the artwork's use of perspective that makes where the dragon and humanoid begin and end blur. So I don't think that the transition to 3D would be particularly graceful. If a game does use 2D images and sprites again, then this design would fit right in and would be one of my first recommendations. However, given the industry's and fandom's obsession with impressive graphics, another 2D SMT game is unlikely, at least for the immediate future. Napaya, the pixie of this game. While I didn't like this initially as it felt like a pixie knockoff at first, in hindsight, I feel like this is a refreshing alternative that I wouldn't mind seeing return. Medusa, another design from the late Yasuhiro Nirasawa sensei. Medusa is a design that I seem to be in the minority of people who like, at least when compared to the most radical of Doi sensei's redesigns for SMT4 Apocalypse, at least in terms of designs done by guest artists. However, I feel that the aesthetically ugly but easy on the eyes Medusa is a better interpretation to her mythological roots than the strange trend of making the Gorgon attractive found in anime. She just didn't make the cut because I'm not sure that this would be preserved in 3D. And finally, the remaining National Defense divinities. If it isn't obvious from this list, I feel like the artists who worked on the National Defense divinities were very consistent in making them amongst the best designs in the game. The tokusatsu elements really working to sell an almost heroic angle to Japan's historic folk heroes and military generals turned guardians of the country in demonhood. While this element was not universal, it also served to make the outliers stand out all the more, and I can still see these designs being either a villain of the week, enemy general, or Sentai ally in a tokusatsu, which still helps to make them feel connected by a similar mindset in design. I'm cheating a little here because I am clumping a lot of designs together, but they are all here for the same reason, were done by the same artist, and the number one spot deserves something special. Keita Amamiya's 6 designs that he contributed are, in order of their appearance, Lilith, the 4 Archangels, and finally Merkaba, the Chariot of God. When on screen like this, I'm sure you can see the similarities, and thus the reasons why these designs being in different spots would have been repetitive and thus redundant. Angels in the Bible were described as eldritch abominations, and the higher ranking an angel was, the more inhuman it was supposed to look. Which is why I really like these designs specifically, being both mythologically accurate and striking even without that context. And of course, and as with most demons on this list, there are the little touches that further allude to their mentions and placements in mythology and the Bible, such as Raphael, the patron of travelers, holding a walking stick. In fact, the only new angel design that appears in 4, not designed by Amamiya Sensei, is Ancient of Days, exclusive to DLC, and who Shinohara Sensei actually redesigned to try and make in line with Amamiya Sensei's Archangels. Amamiya Sensei's design philosophy when designing the angels was the idea of creating what he deemed organic machinery, which matches the angels' depiction quite well. But also surprising was in how he applied this same design ideology to Lilith, and managed to make her fit into the mold of his art, but also still feel distinct from the angels and naturally chaos aligned. Though typically associated with snakes, Lilith was also known as the Night Owl, hence the somewhat feathery texture to her distorted limbs and jaw. The heavy contrast of porcelain pale skin and said texture being black is immediately eye-catching, as is the contrast between her deformities and the preservation of her feminine body. It strikes an odd balance between breathtaking to behold and yet disturbing in its presentation, and I would love to see this design in 3D one day. Hey, thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. As most of my subscribers are relatively recent and don't seem to have watched my video, Top 6 Demons from SMT5 to reappear in Persona 6. Currently, each month I am doing a list of 6 for my top 6 demon designs from each of the numbered SMT games. So if you haven't already, I do recommend watching that video for the extra context as I go into a little more detail on my plans for the series there. Well, in the outro anyway. I still plan on getting at least one more video out before the month is over, but don't expect it until near the end of the month, because that's what the production is looking like for said video. In the meantime, what did you think of my list? Did you agree, disagree? And what are some of your favorites or least favorites designs from the guest artists of this game? And did you prefer those redesigns in For Apocalypse? Personally, I liked 4's designs better for the most part. Please consider commenting about one or multiple of those questions down in the comments, and I will see you before January ends. Until next time.